What we'll talk about today is, we'll start with kind of an overview of what OneDrive is, why we've created it, and sort of what are the supporting activities that you usually need to do when you're planning your rollout of the product. Then we'll talk a bit about some of the components, how you manage them in a large enterprise, and then we'll finish up with how would you actually address a migration type scenario. So we have a bunch of customers that I've been working with who wants to finally get rid of their sort of personal drives or file shares, and how would they then move that content into OneDrive. So we'll have some major announcements in this space happening at Ignite, but so we're really trying to address the kind of the volume migration scenario, how you could get rid of your file shares and move it into OneDrive. So again, why did we create OneDrive? So again, for the consumer, what we wanted to make sure that we have a secure place where I can keep my content and keep it with me so that I have it if I'm sort of traveling. I have the file. It kind of looks like my documents, but it's backed up with the storage in the cloud. So that was kind of the end user goal that we had for the product. And then from the IT point of view, we wanted to make sure that we had the capability of applying policies and have governance and discoverability on the content that we have stored. Because the problem, if you just have content stored on your My Documents in your PC, like it's really hard for the central organization to do any governance or any kind of tracking on what's stored there. And then the final driver was for the business management is having a way to then expose the knowledge. So we internally within the consulting organization at Microsoft have launched an initiative that we call working out loud, because in the past people tend to work and keep there. So I had my documents either on my laptop on my Documents or on a team site that was only shared to the team, and then only when I was kind of ready with my content did I publish it elsewhere. So what we're trying to change here is that by the working out loud is that instead of actually working in silos and then publishing content, we would actually work openly. So for OneDrive, we have a folder called Shared with Everyone. So by default, we're encouraging people to work there. Because just by working there, then suddenly, if you're in SharePoint Online, you get full search discoverability. If you're using Delve, you actually start to see content you see much more content than you see if it goes through a traditional kind of content management publishing process. It's been a big change because a lot of people, especially for us, which we're operating in many cultures, certain cultures tend to be more shy on sharing content. So like if you go to some of the Asian countries, they feel that their content is not good enough until it's completely prepared. Whereas what we're trying to say is it's actually better to find a draft document that helps me than to wait until someone publishes it. So again, that's not a technical change, but that's something that we're trying to sort of steer our people into working out loud. So, and then OneDrive for Business is a key story for us there because again, just by working there, you get the benefits. It's backed up in SharePoint. So if something happens to your machine, you don't lose your data. All the files are backed up in the cloud. It's synced somewhat seamlessly across the different devices. We have, as I mentioned, we have seen a bunch of sync issues, but it's actually gotten better and better. And some of the things that I'll talk about here is how can you preemptively kind of assess your environment so that you wouldn't end up in these sync situations. Because one of the key failures that we've seen are just incompatible file names. So for instance, you have file names or characters in your file names that are supported by the Windows file system but are not supported by SharePoint. Therefore, you get problems when they're uploaded into SharePoint and then the sync fails. So, and behind the scenes, what is OneDrive from a SharePoint point of view? It's kind of the evolution of the My Site concept in the sense that you had in your My Sites in the past, you had the public My Site and the private My Site. So OneDrive is directly an evolution of that. So we're kind of we have hidden away some of that thing. And the way that we expose this is just wide a library. And then like this is an example of my OneDrive library. So I have still some of the stuff that is kind of private only for me, but then I'm actually moving and working more and more in the shared with everyone, because again, if I'm doing a specification for something, for a project to do X, Y, Z, there might be people doing something similar. For them to find my draft is actually better to wait until I finish it. So as with the normal file shares, you can then share content. So in this case, like in the communities folder, I've shared this with Bernd. So we both have full rights in that folder. So again, what we're trying to do is making it very, very seamless and very simple to just share content out of it. So the thing that we saw when we started doing this is, and I'll actually have a slide on this, you have to be a bit mindful, not so much with the personal sites sharing, but if you have collaboration sites or team sites where you have where you're using a lot of metadata. So you may actually end up in situations where the sync will break because of that metadata, and sharing actually has an implication there as well. And I'll come back to that in a couple of slides. So what are then, when you start planning your sort of deployment for OneDrive, so what are the typical steps that you need to take into account? So it all starts by looking at what are the kind of identity options. So if any one of you went to Neil and Manas's session yesterday on how to sort of manage your identities in the cloud or on premises, the identity discussion is typically quite important to see. So for my cloud storage, will I use my own credentials, federated identities? Will I use cloud identities? Will I do directory synchronization? So I'll talk a bit about these, because those are kind of the foundation of getting this thing deployed and activated. Then I'll spend some time in talking about the sync client, which, funnily enough, if you look at the process, it's Groove. So it is the old Groove sync engine that we're still using in 2013. So if you deploy OneDrive, you actually get the Groove bits installed. I'll spend some time in talking about the information architecture, because although that's not too relevant for the personal side of the OneDrive sync, it's really, really important if you're planning to do a kind of an enterprise level team site OneDrive rollout strategy. We have a tool that helps you in planning the network bandwidth. This is important because the first time you sort of push content into OneDrive, you actually upload them to SharePoint. The first time that you sync them, they actually come back, right? So what we've seen with the sort of OneDrive rollouts is that the bandwidth consumption is typically quite high during migration, because we're moving the data there and then syncing it back. But then when you're in steady state, the only thing that we're syncing are the changes. So again, if you do your migration planning, just be mindful that you will have spikes when you do the migration. So one of the strategies that we've used in some cases is actually saying that, well, it's up to the end user, let them worry about that. So let them sync the stuff themselves. But we've also had a number of customers whose IT department says, well, it's not that we don't trust our end users, but it's just that we want to be in control of the migration. So what I'll talk about in the end of the session is kind of how you would do a centrally managed migration project for personal sites. So from identity point of view, what we'll talk about are the cloud identities, the different identities we have in the cloud. How do we synchronize them, and what's the role of ADFS? So is this actually, so let me just pause because we missed some time in the beginning. How familiar are you with cloud identities, directory synchronization, and federation? Can we skip that, or do you want me to cover it? Skip it? Cover it? All right, so let's go quickly through it. So at the end of the day, so like, what are the identity options, what we have? So we have the cloud identities, which are suitable for when you do proof of concepts for small organizations that don't have an on-premises Active Directory to manage their users. The other one, and the key kind of glue here with all of these things is that they're all built on Windows Azure Active Directory. So if you're using cloud users, you're creating them directly into the cloud. If you're using any of the synchronization mechanisms, you actually sync them from your on-premises Active Directory into Azure Active Directory and then use it. Then SharePoint will use it from there. So the capabilities we have for the cloud identities, again, Very trivial. So usually you provision them using PowerShell, or you may have an Excel spreadsheet with your usernames. You just upload them to Azure AD. These are some of the different APIs, so you can programmatically do a bunch of things with this. And this is an area that we actually are expanding more and more. So you can even sort of integrate the Windows Azure Active Directory with your on-premises Active Directory in a way that if you have, let's say, a scenario where you have some of your external users added as cloud identities, you can, even from your on-premises environment, SharePoint environment, authenticate against the Windows Azure Active Directory. So this is playing a big, big role, and especially for some of the other services, if you're doing like Azure or like CRM Online, they're all leveraging the same Azure Active Directory. So that's actually a key component there. So the benefits of the cloud identity, it's very simple to use. There's no affinity to any on-premises. There's no dependency. There's no requirement to having an on-premises directory. The problem is that then those cloud identities just live in the cloud. So you cannot use any of the sort of rules or sort of governance policy that you have on premises. These won't apply for the cloud. So what I've seen is that this is when people are testing the solution, or if they're kind of rolling out for a small unit just to see, this is a good, simple way to get started, to kind of kick the tires to see how it works. But then for most of my customers, they actually, what they want to usually do is they still want to make sure that they have the on-premises Active Directory as the master for all your users. So whenever you're adding a new user, the user gets synchronized to the cloud. So what it means is that we actually have a service or a machine running on premises, which is running what we call the directory synchronization component, which is actually FIM, so Forefront Identity Manager, and it's just sort of pre-configured to synchronize data from your on-premises Active Directory and then take them up to the cloud. There's some requirements that if you actually do this, there's some, again, validation that you need to do on your on-premises environment in order to make it work, because one of the key things from identity point of view is that if you're doing directory synchronization and then the way that users authenticate against Office 365, it's not using like any domain / username, because they're always authenticating using the user principal name. So joeuser@contoso.com. So one of the things that we've seen in kind of these directory sync deployments is that we sometimes have to do Active Directory remediation work to ensure that all the users, for instance, have their user principal names defined. So the directory synchronization, what it does, it takes all the sort of relevant attributes and objects from your on-premises Active Directory, so the users, the groups, and contacts. And we also have plans actually if you're using Intune to extend this so that you could also take your computer accounts from your Active Directory and move them to Azure Active Directory, because then you could have Intune to manage your on-premises machines as well. But that's not being rolled out yet. So again, this allows us to have just a seamless way for the user to we know that it's the same username on both sides. And if a user leaves the company, synchronization just will synchronize those changes against the cloud. So you can also enable what we call a password sync. So what this means is that we'll actually take a hash of your password and sync that to the Azure Active Directory. So we will not synchronize. We don't know your password, but we know the hash. So what this means is that you don't get single sign-on in the sense, but this is what we call the same sign-on. So meaning that you will have the same password in the cloud that you have on premises. And actually the way that this is implemented is that when you enable this, the directory synchronization machine actually registers itself as a password change so that it'll get notifications on password changes. So if a user changes the password on premises, within a minute, we have synced that up to the cloud. But it's still, so the difference here is doing the password sync actually makes it easier because you don't have to remember 2 different passwords. So again, easy to deploy, it reduces the time to solution. one of the key drivers for this have been that there's, like if you do the password sync, you don't have to deploy Active Directory federation services. And to many customers, this is a big saving because the recommended ADFS deployment that we have has 4 servers in it. So it has 2 ADFS proxies that are load balanced and 2 ADFS servers that are load balanced. Because why do we have it like this? Well, the reason why we have an ADFS proxy is so that we can make sure that we're not exposing the full ADFS farm against the internet. So we're just exposing the proxy. And so, but again, that means that you have in a normal Office 365 deployment, you would have, if you have DirSync and then you have the ADFS infrastructure, you have 5 machines, which for some customers is a bit overkill if you don't have that many objects. So for those cases, like the password sync is probably the preferred way to do this. Some of the disadvantages, again, so it is kind of a single point of failure in the sense that if my password sync is failing, then no change notifications will be replicated to the cloud. So, but again, it's quite easy to do this in a resilient fashion because you would just sort of have another DirSync machine if there's an issue that you would just enable and then sync it across. So then the final piece is using ADFS, which is then you extend then your environment by adding the ADFS infrastructure in place, and then you actually get true single sign-on. So then you actually have your authenticating always back against your on-premises Active Directory. So in the 2 first cases, you're authenticating against Azure Active Directory, but in the ADFS scenario, authentication is against your on-premises environment. So this provides the richest way of sort of extending the environment. So because it is then fully a kind of a open and claims-based model for integration. So if you have then an ADFS infrastructure, you can extend that to whatever system you have on premises. So it's actually and this is the way that most of my large customers are using it, because you get all the advantages. It's extensible. You have the full hybrid support. Some of the disadvantages is that it's more complex to configure, so you have to deploy all of the, not just the ADFS farm, but also the proxies. But again, with 365, they're very well prescriptive. So we have good prescriptive guidance, so it doesn't take long. The issue that I've usually seen with this is the duration is more down to the procurement. How quickly can you get machines to do this? So in most cases, these are usually virtualized by the customer as well. So again, so that's kind of from the identity point of view. So from the second piece is, so what do we have then on the client side for OneDrive? So of course, if you don't do sync, then you don't have any client components deployed. But if you use the sync client, you actually get the Groove executable on your machine, and then you get this kind of the pop-up menu from the taskbar. So it is installed as part of the normal Office 365 2013 MSI or the Office 2013 click-to-run client. So you can, if you want, you can kind of have, if you have an older Office version deployed, you can deploy just the sync client if you want. So you can have an Office 2010 environment, but with a 2013 sync client. So what we do here is we actually have improvements to the client. So we are, even though we kind of have a strategy for the new client, we're still improving and adding fixes into the existing Groove client. So we have improvements every month. So if you're using the click to run, so I highly encourage you that whenever the Office client says that there is a new version, just go and update that. Are you using Office 365's click to run Office, or do you still have your traditional MSI deployments? So MSI, hands up. Click to run. So what I've seen, and this is one of those things, when you get your family and relatives, oh, you work for Microsoft, can you fix my machine type of question. So my brother-in-law, they just went Office 365, and so he said, everything is broken. My link doesn't work, my PowerPoint doesn't work, so here, fix it. I said, okay, you get me a bottle of wine and I'll fix it for you. So what we saw in his case was the problem that he had both the traditional MSI installed versions and the click-to-run versions. So therefore you had, because like the click-to-run installation is done, it installs in a different way than the traditional MSI. So with a click-to-run, for instance, you don't need to have admin permissions to your environment. So what we had to do in his case was just uninstall all the Office clients different, so like going and uninstalling both the MSI and then the click-to-run and then reboot and then throw salt over your shoulder, then howl at the moon and then reboot again, and then after that we installed the click-to-run, all the problems went away. So the reason why I'm saying this is that if you have a situation where the Office client is acting funky, just make sure that you don't have both the click-to-run versions and the traditional MSI versions. So if you want to sort of do an enterprise level rollout, you can use the Office deployment tool. So we have kind of a guidance and like the XML files that you can use to package up the client tools as well. So from the planning point of view, so if you're considering to decommission like file stores, file shares, so as with any kind of migration scenarios, you need to assess and figure out what you have. So as part of the assessment activities, what I would do in regards to a file share to OneDrive migration assessment, the first one is like the network. So we're actually doing a pilot with a global customer on doing a file share migration. And one thing that we, in the assessment, found out that depending on where their file shares are, like we will have either a great throughput to the cloud or we'll have a really poor throughput to the cloud. So making sure that you know in your network, so from where are you moving your files. The other thing that we're doing is assessing, like, are there files that are larger than the 2 gig that the sync client supports? And well, to me, if you have larger than 2 gig files, I wouldn't necessarily put them in the cloud anyway, because again, the latency of downloading them. Then the third one, like file types, even though we support almost all the file types with OneDrive, there's still files that shouldn't go to the cloud. So I had an example many years ago where a customer was sort of planning to decommission their file shares and move all the content to SharePoint 2007, so this was like 6 years ago. So what we found in the file shares that they had a bunch of SQL databases like MDF files and LDF files, and they said, can we move those to SharePoint? No, so you should not move in, like even though you can store that file, but it would be absolutely like of no use. So there's still things that should not go to the cloud. So the other thing that I've seen, for instance, so even though we have good streaming support for videos, for instance, in SharePoint Online, I would actually, if you have large videos, consider maybe using Azure Media Services or some other place to actually store them instead of having them, or now with Office 365 using the Office 365 video instead of using them from your OneDrive. So again, knowing what types of files. The permission piece is interesting in the sense that if you're planning to move personal sites, then you have to make sure that the user account that you're using for the migration has permissions to read the content. And also if you're moving content on behalf of someone else to their personal site or to their OneDrive for Business site, you also need to make sure that the migration account has permissions to populate those sites. So once you kind of know what you have, then some of the remediation activities that I recommend that you do is, there's a link here to a tool that's maintained by Bill Baer. It's a tool that goes and analyzes a UNC path and all of the files in it to see if there are characters that are not supported in SharePoint. So where we've seen this to be a problem is for people who are syncing content, let's say from a Mac or from some Unix or Linux machines, because in their file systems, if a file name is in uppercase, it's a different file than if you have the file name in lowercase. Whereas on the Windows file system, those are the same files. So what we've seen in those cases that we get sync issues or sync errors because of these files. So this tool actually, then you run it, it's a script, sort of command line utility, you run it, it produces a CSV file with all the findings. So as part of your kind of remediation project, I would just scan all of the file shares up front and then just figure out if there are any issues, fix them before you move them. The other one is folder restrictions. In SharePoint, we have a maximum URL length of 253 characters. So if you have really verbose directory names with really extra long subdirectory names with even longer file names in it, you might easily end up in a situation where the total URL length is about 253 characters. So again, be mindful of those. And then, so this is a tricky one to address, because then who makes the call on how should we kind of compress these things? So like, what's the naming convention if you have someone has kind of gone through and created, this is my project report from blah, 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 blah folder. So what would be the right name? So in those cases, it's typically not something, you could automate that and use like folder names like GUIDs or something like that if you just wanted to piss off your users. But but the thing that I would do in cases like this, if you find these, again, just see, well, make sure that you know then the owner, so whose files. So it works well if it's a personal drive, because it's typically, in this case, if there would be something like this in the Robin F folder, I would know that, okay, dear Robin, please change this folder name to be something. So again, so the remediation activity typically in a file or OneDrive for business migration is an iterative process where you sort of run, you get those, you fix whatever you can, and then you sort of delegate the fixes to the content owners. Question?
Does Python support other language characters like
The tool or OneDrive in general? OneDrive supports most of them, but not all of them. So what I've seen is the best way of testing it is just to try to upload a file with the naming convention that you have and see if SharePoint accepts it. If SharePoint accepts it, then it works. So we have if you go to that URL, he actually links into a knowledge base article where he lists all the file names and all the special character supports that we have. So what might happen if you have extended character sets is that the file name would look really weird in SharePoint, like question mark, and question mark stuff. So again, run the tool, look at the content, and see how it helps. So once you have kind of done those remediation activities, then the next thing that you should do before you start executing your migration is thinking about the information architecture, because what OneDrive supports is synchronization from personal sites and from team sites. So, and we today have a limit of, we only support a synchronization of 20,000 items from a personal site. To me, this is a bit annoying because we've announced that we have unlimited storage, but we can only sync 20,000 items. And today, the sync client doesn't have any capabilities of doing selective syncs. So the challenge is that if you have more than 20,000 items in your OneDrive for Business folder, then you can't sync it. So then the way that you would then use it would be to just use it as as online only. So then you would still have the access via the client. You would have what we call the placeholder files in Windows Explorer, but those files would only be accessible as long as you have network connectivity. So we are working on that. So the other issue is that per team site, or actually per folder, or sorry, per document library, in a team site, the maximum number of items that we sync is 5,000. Well, and we haven't seen actually those limits being a big issue yet, but I'm betting that we'll start to see more. When we get more and more content into it, we'll see more and more. The thing that actually was the most challenging for us in the project that I was working on was this second one, the last bullet here. So we can only have 12 lookup columns in a list. This is a problem, especially for team sites, if you have content types with clear taxonomy fields, because what constitutes a lookup column in SharePoint? So each user column, so the created by, the modified by, are lookup columns because they're doing a lookup against the site users table or the site users list. So there's two. If you have the checkout capabilities, checked out to is a lookup field. If you have a taxonomy field, those are lookup fields. So when we planned our information architecture for the in the campus project for our enterprise services knowledge management solution, we said that in our taxonomy that we had 12 columns because we wanted to get the maximum number of, the maximum discoverability, so we were using all the available columns. Then what happened was suddenly sync started to break, and we're like, what? Because we're not above that, but then, so we were troubleshooting with the engineers, support engineers, and what we found out was that, so even though we had 12 columns, but then when you start sharing, so if you say share this file or share this folder, what SharePoint does then is it adds a user column into that list. Because the shared with, so if I share a document with Paul, you can see like the shared with Paul, and you see Paul's name. That's because it's stored in a list column value. So that broke our sync. And to make it more complex for us was that the sync still kept on working for the guy who originally did the sharing, but not for anyone else. And we were like, hang on, what's going on here? So what happens is that the Groove client has a cache for the list schema. So when he synced the list, he actually only had 12 lookup columns. Groove was happily syncing everything. Then when we added a column, then when the next person tried to sync, Groove found 30 and said, can't do anything. And it kept on working for him until like 3 days later or something like that, it started breaking. So Groove caches the sync. So again, edge case, but you might run into is that if you suddenly get this, the error message in sync client, you have too many lookup columns. This is probably then, well, because you've gone above this. If this would be an on-premises deployment, you could actually change the web application policy to allow more list columns, but that wouldn't help against Office 365 because you don't have access on that level of configurations there. So this was some of the things so that we discovered. We have an Excel spreadsheet available. I should have actually added the URL here, which kind of gives us a simple calculation formula. If you know, like, what's the average file size, what's the kind of like how many hours per working day, so you get some level of calculation on like what's the estimated network consumption. So again, as I said, the network consumption will probably be high when you do the migration because you are moving the content to the cloud and then you're syncing it back. But then once you're in steady state, you can use these formulas to see what's the kind of the average throughput consumed by OneDrive. So the other thing that, as part of the OneDrive rollout, is that you can configure redirection in SharePoint Server 2013. So meaning that if you have, some people have their personal sites in the cloud, whilst others have it on premises, you can do that configuration automatically so that even if a user is accessing their kind of personal sites from the on-premises SharePoint, they would be redirected to the cloud and then vice versa. So the requirements for that is you have to have Service Pack 1 for SharePoint Server 2013 deployed on premises. You have to have, obviously an Office 365 subscription so that you could redirect to the cloud. And then if you do this, you need ADFS to get the seamless kind of authentication flow automatically. So the way it looks is that you have then the capabilities that you see in when you're looking at central admin, you have the configure OneDrive and sites link. So for those of you who remember how did we do multiple My Site hosts in SharePoint, it's exactly the same concept. So we can define audiences, and based on these audiences, we then have say that members of this audience, their My Sites are here. Members of that audience, the My Sites are still on premises. So the redirection, this is kind of your on-premises My Site host, and then the audience that you sort of have. And in this case, so if you're doing this against 365, you should do the same configuration in Office 365. So this is can be challenging in the sense that if your audiences are based on kind of a user profile attributes that are customized on premises, then you would have to do the same customization in the cloud. So you would have to add the same user profile properties in the cloud as well. But then once you have this, it'll be then just the same process where you would go and sort of see the redirection. So let me just go.
So then the clicking on the link on OneDrive would actually take you over. So again, depending on the scenario here, so once you're authenticated, you're logged on premises, you click on the OneDrive for Business, then depending on which audience you're a member of, so if you're a member of the OneDrive audience, means that then your personal site is in the cloud, otherwise you'll be redirected. So it's exactly the same concept that we had for multiple My Site hosts in SharePoint since 2003, actually. No. So the redirection requires 2013 and Service Pack 1. So, but from the cloud, you have to have the 2013. So, so once you've kind of done the planning and configuration, so the rollout steps are quite straightforward. So because it starts by making sure that you have assigned a SharePoint license to the user, because again, if you don't have a SharePoint license, then there won't be a personal site for that user. Then that user will not exist in the user profile store, and therefore we can't create the personal site as well. So the rollout steps, assigning license, then optionally going and creating the OneDrive site programmatically. So we have capabilities in the product to sort of create these on behalf of other users. And then the final thing is making sure that we have the client deployed. So how do users get the OneDrive sites? So easiest way is when they're in the office, the app launcher, just clicking on their OneDrive, and then if they don't have their site provisioned, then once you click that, then SharePoint will provision that for you. So that's the normal way. And then you could also do it via Office when you're doing a save, and then you would allow the Office client to create it. But then if you have a migration project, you would then have migration tools or scripts that would pre-create the OneDrive sites and then to push content into it. And if you choose to do that, you need to make sure that you assign the right permissions to the migration account so that it can load content to your document library. So for the sync client, again, the easiest way, the click to run, you don't have to worry about what. If you want to sort of do it more managed, so then you can use the Office deployment tool and then just use these configuration files where you would, instead of having people or your users downloading the bits from the internet, you would download them and have them have kind of installation points within your organization. And here you can also define then like what version, like what language, what locale, how do we do sort of updates, do we do automatic? So you have the full configuration capabilities. What I've seen is that I've seen more and more organizations actually allowing their users to do the click-to-run deployments because it's so much easier for IT. They don't have to worry about this. So, and then updating, and as I said, so I would use these configurations. So again, enabling updates because we are fixing them quite frequently. And then, so having the automatic update is probably the easiest way. But then alternatively, if you want to control it yourself, you could just say that, well, yes, we will update, but it'll be my responsibility to download the bits every now and then and put them in a file share. So before SP1 in the Office client, we only had one kind of installation point for the full organization. This was challenging because if you had a global organization, you usually want to have those installation points close to your user base. So now we actually support having like these to be kind of replicated file shares across, so you can actually have multiple installation points. So we've actually done a lot of work in this space. So again, no automatic updates. If you say that I don't want, and I want to keep this particular version, you can sort of configure that one as well. I would never actually do the no automatic updates because we are doing tons of fixes into the sync client. So the next topic, so migration. So for migration with OneDrive, it's kind of we usually see these three approaches. So for instance, the way that Microsoft migrated our 130,000 My Sites was by the first option, well, self-service. So we actually, or MSIT enforced the migration by saying that, well, we will shut down your personal sites in 6 months' time. Please take all the content that you want and make sure that you move it across. So we had the self-service approach. We kind of instructed our users to either just upload the content manually or then have the sync client and then dragging and dropping those files into the sync client folder. So, but what I've seen more and more of my customers actually asking for is either the IT-driven bulk upload or then the IT-driven full migration, where we have kind of migration tools to do this. And here the sort of the difference here is that with the bulk approach would be kind of a very straightforward, only targeting the file share scenario. So the bulk upload would be create the OneDrive site, assign the permissions, upload the content, remove the permissions, and so on. The IT-driven migration would be more for if you're moving, let's say, a personal site and you have also list content or kind of a non-document type of content, then you would use the migration tools. So but in all of those cases, you actually usually have to have the personal sites created beforehand. So we did not have this capability, and when we launched 2013, we added the support in Service Pack 1. So in Service Pack 1, we can now request, we can sort of queue up personal site requests on the service, and then SharePoint will do it behind the scenes for us. So, and the other thing I already mentioned, so if you do bulk migrations, you usually have to assign a migration account into the personal site. Because by default, when you deploy a personal site, it is, like the name says, personal. So only one who has content to your personal site is you. So we have a script where we can set the secondary site collection owner, for instance, to be the migration account. Then we perform the migration, and then once we're done, we're just removing it. So for bulk provisioning, we have a queue, and it's limited to 200 requests at a time, and the queue is shared amongst all the tenants on that particular SharePoint farm. So the way that you would do, if you have, let's say, 10,000 users, if you try to sort of go above 201, we would just ignore them. So you have to sort of do a request out of 200, and then once they're done, then you can request the next one. So, and again, it is shared by the tenants. So if we have many tenants trying to do the same thing at the same time, we'll probably see throttling. So we might see that then the throughput of the site creation actually varies. So provisioning, again, there's no SLA on how quickly can we guarantee that you have your personal site created. Our internal goals is that 90% of the personal site requests should be created within 15 seconds. So typically, again, if you have a large number of these, just make sure that in your project plan you reserve enough time to get these sites pre-created for you. So, and like the improvements we've seen since we launched 2013 and SharePoint Online on 2013 to today has been huge, because in the beginning, it could take up to like 90 seconds to get a personal site created. And so in a multi-tenant environment where you have many tenants trying to do it at the same time, it was really, the performance was just awful. So we've done a lot of work in improving the queuing, improving the capabilities, but it's still one of those more expensive operations within SharePoint Online. So again, as part of your kind of OneDrive for migration, OneDrive for business migration plan, you should actually reserve enough time to get these sites created. So the migration process, the way that I would build this is that, especially for the home drives, most of the cases, the home drives are typically mapped in Active Directory. So there's the home directory or home drive attribute for a user object in AD. So the way that I would build a process like this would be by just listing all the users from AD, getting the UNC paths that points actually to the file server storing the personal documents, then having a kind of scheduling engine where you essentially have a list of, like, these are the file shares and these are then the personal sites, and then have a process by that when then, like, one at a time would just go and request the site, create the site, start migrating the content. So this is actually a process that we are doing with a couple of customers at the moment, where we're kind of testing out some pre-release bits that we will announce at Ignite, where actually we're trying to sort of speed up this process quite heavily. So, but the thing that is kind of here very sort of easy to do is actually, like there's not really many complex things here. This is typically the one which may be a bit time consuming where you're creating the site. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. And this is like for us, from the engineering groups, one of our key targets for the near future is actually helping with the kind of OneDrive for Business migration scenario, because we know that once you get content into OneDrive, then all the other functionalities like Delve and all of those become much, much more valuable. But so to summarize, so for any kind of a migration for OneDrive, again, keep it simple, because the more complexity you add, the more risk, the more sort of duration you get in the project. So migrations from OneDrive, if they're document-centric, typically they're quite straightforward. If they're moving from a Windows file share into OneDrive, you typically have less issues than if you're moving from a Unix-based file share into OneDrive. Set realistic expectations for throughput. Again, it very much depends. So don't sort of commit to timelines without doing a proper pilot where you're testing. So for instance, what we're usually doing is if we have a customer that has, let's say, 3 locations where they have file shares, we'll do a kind of a pilot where we're taking like 15 users per location and then do kind of an estimation of what's the throughput that we're getting. And then I usually multiply those estimations by pi to get the duration. And I have a scientific basis why I do pi. It's because like in Finland, the working day is 7.5 hours. If you divide 24 by 7.5, you get something that's close to pi. So if I say that it can be done in 3 days, it doesn't necessarily mean 3 business days, it's 72 hours. So, but anyway, so again, set realistic expectations of throughput. Don't overcommit on this, because even though you get a great throughput today, you might not get the same throughput tomorrow, because again, you're typically migrating into an environment that is shared with other customers. Worst case scenario would be that all of the tenants on the same farm would be doing migration at the same time. Of course, you would actually get the impact in throughput. So again, have realistic timelines. Oh, and as with any project, expect errors. So it's not likely that the project will go completely without any hiccups. So make sure that you have the communications channels planned, so that, for instance, the end users know, so, well, how long will my home drive be inaccessible, or will it be read-only access throughout the project or not? So again, those things depend. So I wanted to finish with some of the kind of a roadmap things. So what's happened? So this is kind of looking at the history. So we've actually added a bunch of functionality. So the thing that you have seen is that we've added the new iOS app. We're adding more and more auditing and reporting capabilities so that you can do, if you have e-discovery needs, that we're adding more capabilities in OneDrive as well, because at the end of the day, it is this content is stored in SharePoint. So the 1 terabyte storage, we actually are now saying that it's unlimited storage, but to me, unlimited storage and the limitations with sync, it's still an issue. So what we sort of have committed to is that we are actually moving into the next generation of OneDrive sync experience. So we have merged the teams. So we've taken the consumer OneDrive team and then the OneDrive for Business team. They are all in the same team. So our ultimate goal is actually to move into one code base, one sync engine that actually takes the best of both sides. So again, I don't have any timelines of when this will be made available, but it is one of the most highest priority things at the moment, and I'm expecting that we will announce something in this space in Ignite in 2 weeks' time. So stay tuned to see the follow the OneDrive blog to see content from there. But again, this is one of the top priorities for the SharePoint team at the moment, is fixing all the OneDrive issues and sort of adding the capabilities that our competition has. So with that, thanks for attending. If there's any questions, I'll take them offline so that the next presenter can get on stage. Thank you.